Welcome back to part 4 of Eden in Egypt, a 4-part series on the hypothesis that the Garden of Eden could be Egypt's Nile Delta. Please refer back to parts 1 to 3 to get better context of my arguments. Now let's finish on a few more hints that I think could be pointing to Egypt being the Garden of Eden.
Crusaders heard vague tales and fabulous legends of a land that sounded just like the Garden of Eden. It was said to be ruled by a legendary king.
Prester John was supposed to have been a Christian king who occupied a territory somewhere near the Holy Land and who supposedly had a Christian army that could come to help with the Crusaders conquer Jerusalem.
In 1165 AD, a letter from Prester John began to circulate throughout the kingdoms of Europe.
In our land is the most exalted and noblest crown in all the world, as well as the tree of life. And this tree is close to the earthly paradise, only a day's journey away.
In 1177, Pope Alexander III sent his personal envoy on a mission to find Prester John. He left Jerusalem in September, riding east. He was never heard from again. Rumors continued to float through Europe that the armies of Prester John were about to arrive to help the failing Crusades. Prester John never came. A more famous quest for Prester John took place in 1266 by a Venetian explorer named Marco Polo. Despite Marco Polo's fame as the first European to reach Beijing, his real goal was to find the land of Prester John and the Garden of Eden, which the Emperor of China claimed lay just at the border of his empire. Based on Marco Polo's tales, the land of Prester John and Eden both began to appear on maps, often on the coast of China.
There are several images of Prester John on the maps that come out of the Majorcan tradition of map making. He's obviously part of a territory that people should be able to reach.
Some maps placed Prester John and Eden in Asia. Some placed it in Africa. But all the maps contained the biblical reference points of 4 rivers that met at the garden.
In the documentary Mysteries on the Garden of Eden, they explain how Prester John had to be near Jerusalem in order to help out in the Crusades. I think most likely this was not his original name. We also learned that Marco Polo heard from the Chinese, who also had a similar legend of a lost paradise referenced to as Agartha or Shambhala, as I explained in part 2. Keep in mind the Chinese saw their kingdom as the center of the world, which is why they called their country Zhongguo. But this was more of a narrow-minded perspective on the world and how they made their maps. It's possible the name Zhongguo was inspired by a legend of a paradise, as we see if the Chinese character for garden is similar to the character for China, with its enclosed square pictogram and reference to agriculture. The Chinese hint that the legend of a lost paradise was on the edge of their kingdom. Now some thought it could be Japan, but this is out of the context of the original legends. But it's also known that under the Ming Dynasty that the Chinese had visited Africa with Admiral Zheng He on the Great Voyage from 1405 to 1433. As a Chinese Muslim, Zheng He believed that the Garden of Eden was in Africa, and it is hinted that Prester John was also believed to be near the borders of Africa and Asia. To the Chinese, Asia was part of the known world of China, but Africa was more of a mysterious land to the Chinese until Zheng He's expeditions. We need to keep in mind the context of how people viewed maps back in those days, which YouTuber Knowing Better explains.
Well, back in the day, maps were often oriented with east on top, not north. And at the very far end of the east, or on top of the map, you would find the earthly paradise, also known as the Garden of Eden. This paradise was often depicted as sitting on top of a protuberance. In one letter in 1498, Columbus ponders if this depiction of the Earth might be accurate, and then never mentions it again.
It was clear to historians that Columbus was looking for evidence of these legends, specifically El Dorado, Atlantis, and Eden. The problem was, as new lands are discovered, Eden is placed more and more broadly outside of these lands because these lands don't fit the expectation of what Eden is. So in Columbus's time, Eden is fantasized to be outside the known world. This idea doesn't fit the contextual history though. We keep pushing Eden farther and farther away instead of having a more rational approach. But the hint of Eden being at the protuberance and the edge of China's known world puts Eden back near the Holy Land, or east of Eden, specifically at the juncture of Africa and Asia, according to Columbus's maps. The protuberance of Eden, or the corridor of Africa to Asia, is also the center of the world in the perspective of the maps at the time, from the Greek maps to maps that Columbus used. Also, Prester John gives us a hint that this land is of the most exalted and noblest crowns in the world. What would be more exalting than being a king in the land of the pharaohs? Or at the very least, a king in the region of Upper Egypt towards Ethiopia. Prester John may have been a cultic or Gnostic king. Also, Prester John hints that there was a tree of life in his land, and there has been a tradition of honoring a sacred tree in Egypt, according to Professor John F. Hall of the University of Pennsylvania and Brigham Young University in Utah. He argues this tradition has been readopted when Mary and Joseph fled to Egypt. He refers to this tradition as the Lady in the Temple of Ancient Egypt. One of the lady's symbols is the Tree of Life, and this is true in ancient Egypt as well. Professor Hall says there are not two ladies, but one lady venerated in two places. In the Old Kingdom, this tree was the Ishid tree, which is the evergreen tree we call the Persea. The names of the ascended ones are said to be written on its leaves. For a description of this tree, one can turn to the 16th century French book of emblems, the Hadrianus Junius's Emblemata in 1565. Junius quotes Pliny as describing the fruit as either oblong or an almond shape. The fruit of the Persea symbolizes the Sacred Heart of Horus, and eating it gave eternal life and knowledge of the divine plane. This is symbolizing the desire for supernatural powers. In Egyptian mythology, the tree is threatened by the snake god Apophis, the god of the underworld and symbol of the forces of chaos. As one desires of this power, it alters the laws of nature. The tree is protected by the lioness or cat goddess Bast, Lower Egypt's equivalent of Upper Egypt's Hathor. The name Bast means devouring lady. A related mother goddess is Mut, whose name refers to the primordial waters of the cosmos. In their 1899 book, The Temples of Mut and Ashir, the archaeologists Margaret Benson and Janet Gourlay gave some of her titles as Lady of the Sacred Lake and Lady of Ashir. Asheru and Isheru was the name of the sacred lakes of Mut, such as the one in her temple at Karnak, and strongly reminiscent of the Hebrew mother goddess of Ashir. Professor Hall argues more than one type of tree was used to symbolize this desire for the use of magic, and there is another plant that hints to where this garden is located.
There are a lot of different ideas in the literature about what this fruit is. Now, everybody knows about the apple, like we have today, Apple and Eve, this apple juice company, right? So they obviously think that it's an apple.
The Bible never uses the word apple, describing it only as a fruit. In fact, apples were unknown in ancient Israel. Apples were only associated with Eden after 500 AD, when the Bible was first translated into Latin.
What the origins of that are not clear, but many people point to the fact that in Latin you would have a nice pun because the word for evil and apple are the same word.
In Latin, apple is malus, the same word as evil. So what was the actual fruit? Some have suggested the pomegranate, since it was common in ancient Israel. But there's a more interesting suspect that may help lead us to the location of Eden itself.
The fig is often proposed because Adam and Eve covered themselves with fig leaves.
And there is a fascinating connection between the figs of the Bible and some of the most ancient archaeological sites in the world. In 2006, archaeologists in Jordan discovered the oldest remnants of agriculture ever found. 11,000-year-old cultivated figs.
So if we find archaeologically that very, very ancient people were cultivating figs, then I suppose we could say, well, that sort of fits with the story of the Garden of Eden.
It could be corroborating evidence that Eden lay in the region the Bible said it did.
The place where common figs were mass cultivated was in Egypt. The common fig seems to have originated in Western Asia and was grown in Egypt since early times, in slightly higher elevation areas and less saturated grounds within the delta. Large amounts of soil was actually built up to make orchards of figs. Before agriculture, figs were not naturally found in the saturated delta, but along higher elevations of the banks along the Nile. Its fruit often served as offerings, but its wood, on the other hand, was rarely used for timber, although its fiber was used for many household goods. Professor Hall argues later, due to the desiccation of the land, that the Persea died out and its attributes were transferred to the sycamore tree, not to be confused with the sycamore tree mentioned in the Bible, which is a kind of fig tree. Hathor was called the Lady of the Sycamore, and the dead were buried in coffins of sycamore wood, returning them to the womb of the mother goddess. Tomb paintings show Hathor sprouting from the trunk, offering water and the fruit of the tree. In Egypt today, sycamore trees are associated with the Virgin Mary and the Holy Family. An article of the Egyptian Tourist Board in the shades of the tree shows that the oldest sycamore tree in Egypt was in Mataria, and is known as the Virgin Mary tree. And originally this might have had a connection with Eve, and Mary is now seen as the new Eve. And there is another hint pointing to the fig being the symbol of something. Mataria itself is near Cairo in the district of ancient Heliopolis. The legend of the Virgin's tree links to the oldest cultic traditions, for ancient Egyptians venerated trees in Heliopolis beneath which Isis was believed to have suckled the infant Horus. There's clear borrowing or correlation to Jesus' family, although they are not the same. It's simply symbolic correlation to the Egyptian gods. Note too that in the Old Testament, Joseph's wife was the priestess of Heliopolis. It's only later in the New Testament era that people associated the fig as a female genitalia symbol. But in the Old Testament, Adam and Eve lost that virginity when they freely chose and were tempted by the angels or the gods to make a contract in order to possess supernatural abilities. Due to a lack of scientific understanding of how the supernatural works, symbolism is used to explain an event by memorializing it through the attributes of a tree. This is an aspect of garden design, using plants for symbolism and memorialization. There seems clearly a sexual connotation in relation to the supernatural performing a biological alteration of some sort. Understanding phenomena like the poltergeist possession may help us better understand what transpired in Egypt. For now, it seems that the fig is pointing to Egypt as being the Garden of Eden. Also, I would not rule out the possibility that the Bodhi tree in Hinduism and Buddhism, which is Ficus religiosi, meaning religious fig, may have derived from the Persian legends, in turn deriving from Egyptian symbolism of the fig trees. Although they are different types of figs, there could have been a connection to the tree of knowledge and the idea of enlightenment tree. But of course, the symbolism will change and its meaning as the sacred tree tradition is passed on to other cultures, fitting to their times. Even today, companies will play with symbols, such as the Apple Company may have secretly adopted the biblical apple symbol to represent people taking a bite out of their device of knowledge. For the phrase "knowledge is power" is something that the designer Rob Janoff and Steve Jobs believed in. It wasn't much of a leap for them to correlate the apple to the biblical symbol in 1977. Although in 1976 they may not have noticed the original meaning, but I'm sure someone eventually noticed that the symbolism fits quite well. And it would have been fun for them to keep this kind of a secret to themselves. If they had known about the fig, I'm sure choosing a fig over an apple was not as attractive for their logo. I find it interesting, if you look at the negative space when you show the mirror image of the logo, it looks like a humanoid alien-like face with horns looking back at you. Could this represent Satan? I think the supernatural has a way of using pareidolia to subconsciously send us messages. Most likely Steve Jobs and the designer Rob Janoff did not notice this at first. And it was clearly probably accidental, hopefully. But it's something to keep in mind. I don't think it means Steve Jobs had alien technology, but technology is a reflection of our desire for power, this temptation, which the apple symbol fits quite well. Symbolism aside, these hints can point to specific historical events that may have been lost to us. To conclude, there is one more hint pointing to Egypt being the Garden of Eden, and I'll let YouTuber Home Team History explain.
Numerous scholars over the centuries have attempted to figure out how Africa got its name. The origin of the word Africa, surprisingly, is a very hot topic of debate. There is no universal explanation as to how Africa got its name. One popular theory is that Africa was named after a European invader that simply named it Africa. But that's an oversimplification and doesn't at all point to its origin. Another popular idea is that the indigenous name of Africa is Alkebulan. This idea is very popular within the black community. The claim is that Alkebulan is the oldest name for Africa, and that in Arabic it means the land of the blacks. This couldn't be accurate because the word for land of the blacks in Arabic is Balad as-Sudan, unless of course they had two names for land of the blacks, which, if we're honest, doesn't seem to be the case. But according to other sources, the word Alkebulan means mother of mankind, or even Garden of Eden. It's also interesting that the word seems to be of Arabic origin and not African. The modern term of Africa that we use today in the Western world almost certainly comes from the Romans, who called their northern African province Africa. The term Afri is a Latin term which was largely in reference to all lands south of the Mediterranean. It's been suggested that Afri was in reference to a Libyan tribe in the region. Later in history, the term Africa began to be used to refer to the whole continent. Now, even though our modern understanding of the name Africa comes from the Romans themselves still acquired it from somewhere else. In other words, the Romans had help. And there's a more ancient word for the continent. According to Leo Africanus, who seems to have the most reliable information concerning the origin of the name Africa, the name evolved from the Arabs and Berbers. According to one theory proposed by Leo Africanus, a man named Africus was a son of a king of Yemen and the conqueror of the Maghreb, or what we know today as North Africa. After he took North Africa, he naturally named it after himself, Afrikia. However, the Arabs affirm that the name Africa is a corruption of Al-Mafrika, the ancient name of the country beyond the Nile westward. This word meaning disunited or divided, implying that it was cut off from Asia by the Nile. As mentioned before, the word Africa as we know today came from, or was at least influenced by, Roman interaction. Africa, as we know it today, was first used between the first two Punic Wars and took precedence ever since then. The question is, though, did any civilization within the continent of Africa call the continent Africa? And the answer is yes. And the meaning behind the word for these people is very interesting. It was the Egyptians who first called the continent Africa. The claim is that the word Africa is derived from the Egyptian word Afruka, meaning to turn toward the opening of the Ka. The Ka is a sort of life force of every person, and the opening of the Ka refers to a womb or birthplace. Africa would be, for the Egyptians, the birthplace. According to Gerald Massey, an Egyptologist from the 19th century, he states, "The tongue of Egypt tells us that Africa is the inner land born of, literally, the birthplace." So we have the Egyptians themselves telling us that their birthplace was in the inner land of what they called Africa. Is that a coincidence? I don't know. But the fact that the Egyptians were the first to call the continent Africa is extraordinary. Now, as for the other theories, they still have their merit, but they all must pay homage to the original.
I think this clue is quite profound, but we seem to be ignoring it. We get so fixated on the word Eden, we fail to accept the possibility that this word may not have been the original name, but simply the last culture to adopt a possibly older legend of a garden. Politics affects languages, and I think there is a bias against the African hypothesis. Archaeologists can be so narrow-minded on dating of artifacts that they are not willing to accept that maybe they haven't found the older artifacts yet, or accept that their techniques could be skewed. I think it's important for Africans to express their perspective on the Garden of Eden, so I'll let YouTuber Nile Valley History explain this perspective.
We came from the beginning of the Nile, where God happy dwells at the foothills of the mountain of the moon.
We have the continent that one of the most ancient names go back to Akibalon, as also the Grecian society, look at Nigritia. And it is here that our African ancestors from the Great Lakes regions of Africa, as I do in this presentation and civilization, showing where our ancestors migrated down the 4,100 miles of the Nile, where civilization came down the Nile, where our ancestors migrated. It did not come from Mesopotamia into Africa. It came from the heart, because our ancestors said that on the Papyrus of Hunnefer, we clearly stated that we came from the beginning of the Nile, where God happy dwelt at the foothill of the mountain of the moon, that being Kilimanjaro and Rwenzori. And it is here we reach the zenith of civilization in the land of Kemet that they call Egypt today. But this is also the land that's spoke of in the Bible, in the land of Ethiopia, also known as Cush, ancient names also known as Kish, that a river that we returned back there in 83 and 84, that a river compasses the whole land of Ethiopia as it speaks of in the Bible, coming from Lake Tana. And here, so we can clearly understand the land of Ethiopia, I have here from the Webster's Dictionary, clearly showing Ethiopia, where it clearly says an ancient country in northeastern Africa. And it's interesting, right above Ethiopia it has ethics, the science of man's morals and duties and principles. But we go on to see why I put Webster in there, because in Genesis chapter 2 it clearly told us that, and the name of the second river is Gilhon, the same as it that compasses the whole land of Ethiopia. This is where the Garden of Eden was. Why is it that we could not see Africa in the Bible, the country of Ethiopia? Because we were systematically taught to hate Africa, so we could not see Ethiopia. In fact, even though it says Ethiopia, and it doesn't speak of the Tigris and Euphrates River until the third and fourth river, but it goes on to say to the 15th verse that Lord God made man and put man into the garden.
Now, what Genesis did, what the Hebrews did, is they plagiarized from our teachers. In Genesis 2:10, it says this, and the river went out of Eden to water the garden, and this it was parted, it became unto four heads. Let me show you what they're trying to steal from. Now, what you see right here to the right is the resurrected Messiah, the God, the Lord of the perfect black, God Asaf, who was murdered by his brother Set Typhon, and he resurrected to sit upon the throne of judgment in Amenta, which is the afterlife. Now, if you look at the bottom, you'll see the zigzag lines in the oblong rectangle at the bottom with his feet on top of it. That represents the lake of fire. That represents the volcanic region of Central East Africa. And what happened is, early on in our history, those volcanoes went off, and it causes our people to migrate up out of that region. So what you see right here is the lotus. The lotus in ancient Egypt represents birth, resurrection. And you also see the two fallopian tubes on the side of the lotus. And then at the top, you see the four sons of Heru, the four sons of Horus. Now, if you look at the Nile River, you can see it coming up out of Central East Africa. You see it coming up out of the Great Lakes region. And when it gets down to the Mediterranean, it looks like it takes the form of a lotus. But let me show you. That's what it is. And so we're going to go back. And a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and thence it was parted and became unto four heads. These are the heads. These are the four heads. It shows that each one, east, west, north, and south, it represents that our people came up out of Central East Africa, and they come down the river, and they went out east, west, north, and south to populate the globe as we know it today. In Genesis 2:12, this is what it says. And the name of the first is dealing with the rivers that come up out of Eden. The name of the word, the first, is Pis. That is it which conquers the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. Let me show you the map. If you look down there at number 1, that's Havilah. And then number 2, if you read in the Bible, was Cush, Ethiopia. It says Ethiopia. The original, the King James say Ethiopia. Now they're trying to say Cush. Because, see, our babies, they ain't gonna know Cush. We might know it because we do the studies. Ethiopia, as soon as you say Ethiopia, a baby can go to the map. They know where Ethiopia is. That's too easy. So now they want to say Cush. And then it goes, number 3 is Assyria, and the 4 was Shinar.
And a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from this it was parted and became unto 4 heads. The name of the first is Pison, that is which conquers the whole land of Havilah, or Havilah, where there is gold. I'm going to go down. And the gold of that land is good. There's bdellium and the onyx stone. And the name of the second river is Gihon. The same is that compasseth the whole land of Ethiopia. This is the Garden of Eden. And then it goes on to say, and the name of the third river, Hiddekel, that is which goeth towards the east of Assyria, and the 4th river is the Euphrates. So a lot of people say it came out of Mesopotamia. But according to Genesis, it came out of Africa first, and then it went into Mesopotamia. It came up out of Africa. So Cush is Ethiopia, Mizraim is Egypt. You got Havilah over here, and if you go to Genesis 10, verse 7, and it said, the sons of Cush, Seba and Havilah. So this shows that Havilah is the son of Ethiopia. It's the son of Ethiopia. So all of this was African. This is what started it. Now this is according to the Bible. But from the knowledge that we have studied up under our elder scholars, man, listen here, the Egyptians had taken over all of this shit. None of this even exists. This is just according to the Bible. This is biblical mythology. There's some truth in it, but you got to understand it by understanding your original knowledge. And then you can look at this and say, okay, I see where they're coming from. Now you see this backdrop. I had to bring this backdrop out because we are quick to call another man's land holy. We're quick to call Israel holy. Mecca holy. All these other lands holy. But as I showed you that fresh water, as I showed you that rainforest, now I'm going to show you animal life. Not only did humanity begin in Africa, all animal life began in Africa. And so, like I said, if you want a burger, you can have a burger. Huh? You want a giraffe burger? We can have one. We're talking about Israel is the land of milk and honey. Nigga, Israel is a goddamn desert. Check the imports and exports, okay? See, that cuts all the bullshit out. So you can see, the reason why they want you to look to Israel, they want you to look to Mecca. Mecca is another desert, okay? And so you will not look to the most richest real estate on the planet Earth, which is Africa. If you can prove me wrong, I'll be here next Friday. Bring all your goddamn facts and bring them, and you better have them all. And I'll guarantee you I will refute you and send your ass on your way, and your feelings might be hurt, but at least you'll have the truth. Ain't no way you can go to any other land and see that kind of life. No way. No way. Just tens of thousands of species. You got to understand what Africa is. Most people don't even understand what Africa is. So we know for a fact that what we call Egypt came up out of the heart of Africa.
The Egyptian writer Hunefer, Hunefer, in the papyrus of Hunefer said, quote, "We came from the beginning of the Nile, where God happy dwells at the foothills of the mountain of the moon.
I think we need to let geography tell us what fits most logically to the legend, which points to a more historical, accurate interpretation. When we look at the Nile River, it makes logical sense that once the pre-dynastic Egyptian tribes near Lake Victoria figured out how to make rafts, or were brave enough to follow the Nile northward, they would have floated upstream and settled in the delta first, around 60,000 years ago, before dispersing across the globe. The rest of North Africa acted like a barrier to migration. The natural geography of the Nile, with its life-giving volcanic soil, would have sparked a civilization a lot quicker than other regions in the Middle East. Also, could Genesis be hinting that Adam, whoever he may be, was actually black because he was born in the land of the black soil, or the land of Kemet? And poetically, that's how he got his skin color. It's a reference to the identity with the land. I've also wondered if the Sphinx is actually a depiction of a black woman, or Eve, the first lioness queen of Egypt. At first, Egypt could have been mostly black settlers around 60,000 years ago, but over time became the world's first multiracial and cultural civilization that faced a natural disaster in its delta, dispersing people in a second wave out of Africa, which could explain similarities with other mythologies and megalithic architectural traditions. I can't say definitively if Africa is Eden and Egypt's Nile River and delta is the garden, but this is the most logical conclusion when looking at it anthropologically and as an architect. But ultimately, maybe this doesn't matter, because in the eyes of a god or a Type 1 planetary civilization, the whole Earth is our Garden of Eden, our genus loci.